Picture this, a massive Viking warrior standing on the deck of his longship, salt spray hitting his face as he scans the horizon for new lands to explore. But here's what most people don't realize. Beneath his rough woolen cloak and leather armor, his skin tells a story more intricate than any saga ever written. His arms are covered in swirling patterns that seem to dance in the flickering torchlight, each mark carefully chosen to represent his victories, his beliefs, and his connection to the gods themselves. The Vikings weren't just fierce warriors and skilled seafarers, they were walking canvases, living galleries of some of the most sophisticated body art the ancient world had ever seen. While other cultures were still figuring out basic tattooing techniques, these Norse masters had already elevated the practice to an art form that would make modern tattoo artists weep with envy. Take Bjorn the Bold, for instance. This legendary raider from the 9th century didn't just collect treasure from his conquests. He collected stories on his skin. Starting from his teenage years, every significant moment in his life was commemorated with ink. His first successful raid earned him a raven on his shoulder, Odin's messenger, watching over him in battle. When he survived a particularly brutal winter, he added intricate knotwork around his wrists, each loop representing a day he cheated death. But the Vikings didn't just randomly slap designs on their bodies like some kind of ancient Pinterest board gone wrong. Oh no, these people were methodical, spiritual, and incredibly artistic in their approach. They understood that the human body was sacred real estate and every square inch needed to serve a purpose. The process itself was a ritual that could take days or even weeks to complete. Viking tattoo artists, known as skin scribes, were highly respected members of society. They weren't just artists. They were part priest, part historian, part psychologist. Before a single needle touched skin, they would spend hours discussing the client's life story, their aspirations, their fears, and their relationship with the gods. These skin scribes had access to an incredible array of natural pigments that would make modern tattoo ink manufacturers jealous. They created deep blacks from charcoal and soot, rich blues from woad plants, vibrant reds from iron oxide, and stunning yellows from various tree barks. But here's the kicker. They didn't just mix these pigments with water or oil like you might expect. They had secret recipes passed down through generations, often involving animal blood, tree sap, and even ground bones from sacred animals. The tools they used were equally impressive. While other cultures were still using crude bone needles, Viking tattoo artists had developed sophisticated bronze and iron implements. They created needles of varying thicknesses for different line weights, specialized tools for shading, and even early versions of what we might recognize as tattoo machines, mechanical devices that could create consistent repeating patterns. Now let's talk about the designs themselves, because this is where things get really interesting. The Vikings had developed a complex symbolic language that was far more sophisticated than the simple tribal patterns most people imagine. Every symbol had multiple layers of meaning, and the placement on the body was just as important as the design itself. The most popular motifs weren't random decorations, they were carefully chosen power symbols. Ravens were incredibly common, but not just because they looked cool. In Norse mythology, Odin had two ravens, Hugin and Munin, who flew across the 9 worlds every day gathering information. A Viking with raven tattoos was essentially claiming divine intelligence and the ability to see beyond the physical world. Wolves were another favorite, representing not just ferocity in battle, but loyalty to the pack and the wisdom to know when to hunt alone versus when to work as a team. The famous wolf Fenrir, who was prophesied to devour Odin during Ragnarok, represented the ultimate warrior's spirit, powerful enough to challenge the gods themselves. But perhaps the most intricate and meaningful tattoos were the ones depicting the world tree Yggdrasil. These weren't simple tree outlines. They were massive, sprawling designs that could cover an entire back or wrap around a torso. The roots would extend down the legs, representing the underworld and the realm of the dead. The trunk would run up the spine, symbolizing Midgard, the world of humans, and the branches would spread across the shoulders and arms, reaching toward Asgard, the realm of the gods. The level of detail in these world tree tattoos was absolutely mind-blowing. Viking artists would include tiny animals living in the branches, the eagle at the top, the dragon gnawing at the roots, the squirrel running up and down carrying messages between them. They would add runic inscriptions along the trunk, often personal messages or prayers. Some warriors even had their entire family tree incorporated into the design, with each branch representing a different ancestor. Speaking of runes, the Vikings were probably the first culture to extensively use written language as tattoo art. But these weren't just random letters or words. They were carefully constructed spells, prayers, and incantations. A warrior might have a runic inscription on his sword arm asking for strength in battle, while a sailor might have navigation runes tattooed on his palms to help him find his way home. The placement of these runic tattoos was incredibly strategic. Runes for protection were often placed over the heart or on the forehead. Runes for wisdom went on the temples or behind the ears. Runes for strength were commonly found on the arms and hands. It was like having a personal magical arsenal written directly on your body. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The Vikings didn't just tattoo themselves. They tattooed their weapons, their ships, and even their animals. Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking swords often had runic inscriptions etched into the blades, and some longships had protective symbols carved into their hulls. There are even accounts of Viking war horses having their manes dyed with the same pigments used for tattoos, creating mobile works of art that struck fear into the hearts of enemies. The social aspects of Viking tattoo culture were equally complex. Different designs indicated different social classes, occupations, and achievements. A simple farmer might have basic protective runes, while a wealthy jarl could afford elaborate full-body murals depicting entire mythological scenes. Warriors had their own specific iconography, as did merchants, craftsmen, and even slaves. Women in Viking society were just as tattooed as men, but their designs often focused on different themes. While men might choose aggressive war imagery, women often selected symbols of fertility, wisdom, and protection for their families. The goddess Freya was a popular choice, often depicted with her falcon cloak or surrounded by cats. Some women had intricate knotwork patterns that were believed to help with childbirth, while others chose designs that would make them more attractive to potential husbands. The tattooing process itself was a community event. When someone decided to get a major piece done, it wasn't unusual for friends and family to gather around sharing stories, singing songs, and offering support during the more painful moments. These sessions could last for days, with breaks for meals, sleep, and celebration. By the end, the newly tattooed person wasn't just sporting fresh ink. They had been through a transformative experience that bonded them more closely to their community. The healing process after getting a Viking tattoo was almost as ritualistic as the tattooing itself. Unlike today's sterile aftercare routines, Vikings had developed their own sophisticated methods using natural ingredients that were surprisingly effective. Fresh tattoos were treated with a mixture of honey, herbs, and animal fat, a combination that modern science has proven to have genuine antibacterial and healing properties. The honey acted as a natural antiseptic, while specific herbs like yarrow and comfrey promoted skin regeneration. But the real magic happened during the healing ceremonies. Vikings believed that as the skin healed around the new tattoo, the design became permanently bonded not just to the body, but to the soul. During this vulnerable period, the tattooed person would often retreat to a sacred space, sometimes a grove, sometimes a special room in their longhouse, where they would meditate on the meaning of their new markings while the skin slowly recovered. The variety of tattoo styles across different Viking regions was absolutely staggering. Norwegian Vikings, who spent most of their time navigating treacherous fjords, developed a distinctive style featuring flowing wave-like patterns that seemed to move with the body's natural curves. These designs often incorporated sea creatures like whales, seals, and the legendary sea serpent Jormungandr, whose body was said to encircle the entire world. Danish Vikings, on the other hand, preferred more geometric patterns. Their tattoos featured intricate interlocking shapes that created optical illusions when viewed from different angles. These weren't just pretty decorations. They were mathematical marvels that demonstrated the Vikings' sophisticated understanding of geometry and proportion. Some of these patterns were so complex that modern mathematicians are still trying to figure out how they were constructed without advanced measuring tools. Swedish Vikings took yet another approach, focusing on what we might call biographical tattoos. These were elaborate pictorial narratives that told the story of a person's life from birth to death. A typical Swedish Viking warrior might have scenes from his childhood on his legs, his coming-of-age ceremony on his torso, his first battle on his arms, and his greatest achievements on his back. Looking at one of these warriors was like reading a living autobiography. The Icelandic Vikings, isolated on their volcanic island, developed perhaps the most unique tattoo tradition of all. They incorporated actual volcanic ash into their ink, creating tattoos that had a distinctive gritty texture and deep black color that seemed to absorb light. These ash-based tattoos were believed to contain the power of the earth itself, connecting the wearer to the raw geological forces that shaped their homeland. But it wasn't just the regional differences that made Viking tattoos special. It was their incredible attention to seasonal and astronomical elements. Many Vikings had tattoos that were designed to interact with natural light in specific ways. Summer solstice tattoos would be placed on parts of the body that caught the most sunlight during the longest day of the year. Winter solstice designs were positioned to be illuminated by firelight during the darkest months. Some of the most sophisticated Vikings had what we might call living calendars tattooed on their bodies. These were complex arrangements of symbols and patterns that could be used to track the passage of time, predict seasonal changes, and even navigate by the stars. A skilled Viking could literally read his own body like a cosmic map, determining everything from the best time to plant crops to the optimal moment to launch a raid. The connection between Viking tattoos and their spiritual beliefs went far deeper than most people realize. These weren't just decorative markings, they were functional magical tools. Vikings believed that certain tattoo combinations could provide protection in battle, enhance physical strength, improve luck in trading, or even grant the ability to communicate with the dead. The process of choosing these magical tattoos was incredibly complex. It wasn't enough to simply pick a design that looked powerful. The symbols had to be mathematically and spiritually compatible with each other and with the person's existing tattoos. Viking tattoo artists spent years studying the intricate relationships between different symbols, learning which combinations would enhance each other's power and which might create dangerous conflicts. For example, a warrior might want both a bear tattoo for strength and a raven tattoo for wisdom. But simply placing these two symbols anywhere on the body could create spiritual chaos. The bear and raven had to be positioned in specific relationship to each other, often with connecting elements that would harmonize their energies. This might involve adding runic bridges between the designs or incorporating shared elements like trees or mountains that both animals could inhabit peacefully. The most powerful Viking tattoos were those that told complete mythological stories. These weren't just pictures, they were functional religious texts written in skin and ink. A master-level tattoo might depict the entire story of Ragnarok, the end of the world, starting with the first signs of doom on the ankles and working up to the final battle between gods and giants across the chest and back. These narrative tattoos served multiple purposes. They were personal reminders of important religious teachings, they were conversation starters that could help Vikings connect with strangers, and they were educational tools that could be used to teach children about their cultural heritage. A well-tattooed Viking was essentially a walking library, carrying the most important stories of his people wherever he went. The technical skill required to create these complex narrative tattoos was extraordinary. Viking tattoo artists had to be master storytellers, skilled artists, and expert anatomists all at the same time. They needed to understand how the human body moved and changed over time, ensuring that their designs would still look good decades later as the skin aged and stretched. They also had to account for the three-dimensional nature of the human body. A flat drawing might look perfect on paper, but translating it to the curved surface of a shoulder or the complex topology of a rib cage required advanced spatial reasoning skills. The best Viking tattoo artists could visualize how a design would look from every possible angle, ensuring that the tattoo would be visually striking whether the person was standing, sitting, fighting, or sleeping. The pigments used in Viking tattoos were works of art in themselves. These weren't simple dyes. They were complex chemical compounds that had been refined through generations of experimentation. The deep blue that Vikings used for their most sacred tattoos, for instance, was created using a process that took months to complete. Woad plants had to be harvested at exactly the right time of year, fermented using specific bacterial cultures, and then combined with other ingredients in precise proportions. The red pigments were even more complex. The most prized red ink was made using a combination of iron oxide crushed garnets and the blood of specific animals that had been sacrificed during religious ceremonies. This wasn't just about getting the right color. Vikings believed that the spiritual essence of the sacrificed animal would be transferred to the tattoo, giving the wearer access to that animal's special powers. Green pigments were perhaps the most challenging to create. Vikings had to extract chlorophyll from specific plants, stabilize it using copper compounds, and then preserve it in a medium that wouldn't fade over time. The process was so difficult that green tattoos were considered a mark of extreme wealth and status. Only the most successful Vikings could afford to have green elements in their tattoos. The social dynamics around Viking tattoos were fascinating and complex. Getting tattooed wasn't just a personal decision. It was a community event that required approval from family members, religious leaders, and sometimes even the local chieftain. The designs had to be appropriate for the person's social status, age, and life circumstances. Young Vikings typically started with small, simple tattoos that marked their transition from childhood to adulthood. These might be basic protective runes or simple animal symbols that represented their family clan. As they grew older and achieved more in life, they would add increasingly complex designs that reflected their growing status and experience. The most elaborate tattoos were reserved for the elderly, who had earned the right to carry the most powerful and complex symbols. An old Viking warrior might have tattoos that covered every inch of his body, creating a living masterpiece that told the story of an entire lifetime. These elder Vikings were walking museums, and younger people would often seek them out just to study their tattoos and learn from the stories they contained. The decline of Viking tattoo culture is one of history's greatest artistic tragedies, but understanding how it happened reveals just how sophisticated and deeply integrated these practices were in Norse society. When Christianity began spreading through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, it didn't just change religious beliefs, it fundamentally altered the entire cultural framework that had supported Viking body art for centuries. The Christian church viewed tattoos as pagan symbols that connected people to the old gods, and they systematically worked to eliminate these practices. But the Vikings didn't give up their tattoo traditions easily. Archaeological evidence suggests that many converted Vikings found creative ways to blend Christian and Norse imagery, creating hybrid designs that satisfied both their new faith and their cultural heritage. Some of the most fascinating discoveries from this transitional period show Vikings incorporating Christian crosses into traditional Norse knotwork, or depicting biblical scenes using classic Viking artistic techniques. One particularly remarkable find from a 12th century burial site in Norway shows a warrior with a tattoo of Christ's crucifixion rendered in the distinctive interlacing style that Vikings had perfected over centuries. But perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was the development of hidden tattoos. Designs that appeared to be simple Christian symbols from a distance, but revealed complex Norse imagery when examined closely. A cross might have tiny runes worked into its surface, or a depiction of a saint might be positioned in a way that created the silhouette of Odin when viewed from a specific angle. The technical knowledge required to create these hidden tattoos was extraordinary. Viking tattoo artists had to master not just traditional Norse symbolism and Christian iconography, but also advanced techniques in optical illusion and visual perception. They were essentially creating early forms of what we might recognize today as optical art, or even augmented reality images that changed meaning depending on how they were viewed. The preservation of Viking tattoo knowledge during this period of cultural suppression was largely thanks to the skalds, the poet-historians who memorized and passed down oral traditions. These master storytellers didn't just preserve the myths and legends of the Viking Age, they also maintained detailed knowledge of tattoo symbolism, placement techniques, and spiritual meanings. The skalds developed elaborate memory systems that allowed them to encode tattoo designs into their epic poems. A casual listener might hear a thrilling tale of heroic adventure, but a trained tattoo artist could decode the verses to extract precise instructions for recreating specific designs. This hidden curriculum ensured that Viking tattoo knowledge survived even when the practice itself was forbidden. The materials and tools used by Viking tattoo artists were so sophisticated that some techniques weren't rediscovered by European tattooists until the 19th century. The bronze and iron needles found in archaeological sites show evidence of advanced metallurgy, with some implements featuring multiple points arranged in specific patterns that could create complex textures and shading effects with a single application. The ink preservation methods were equally impressive. Vikings had developed techniques for creating tattoo pigments that would remain vibrant for decades using natural stabilizers and binding agents that modern chemists are still trying to fully understand. Some of these ancient formulas produced colors that were more durable and fade-resistant than many contemporary tattoo inks. The social impact of losing this tattoo tradition was profound and long-lasting. Viking society had used body art as a primary means of social identification, historical record-keeping, and spiritual expression. When these practices disappeared, entire systems of cultural knowledge went with them. The ability to read a person's life story from their tattoos, to understand their spiritual beliefs at a glance, to recognize their clan affiliations and social status, all of this was lost. But the influence of Viking tattoo culture didn't completely disappear. It went underground, surviving in modified forms among certain groups and gradually influencing the development of tattoo traditions in other parts of Europe. Sailors in particular adopted many Viking-inspired designs and techniques, carrying these artistic traditions to ports around the world. The Celtic revival movements of the 18th and 19th centuries rediscovered many Viking tattoo motifs, though often without understanding their original meanings. The intricate knotwork patterns that had once been sophisticated magical symbols became purely decorative elements. The powerful runic inscriptions that had served as personal spells and prayers were reduced to exotic-looking alphabet letters. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed just how extensive Viking tattoo culture really was. Ground-penetrating radar and advanced imaging technologies have allowed researchers to examine preserved skin samples from bog bodies and frozen remains, revealing tattoo patterns that were previously invisible. These discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of Viking society, showing that body art was far more prevalent and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The most recent discoveries have been particularly exciting. In 2019, researchers using new chemical analysis techniques were able to identify tattoo pigments on Viking remains that had been in museum collections for decades. These findings revealed that Viking tattoos were not only more common than previously thought, but also more colorful and complex. The revival of interest in Viking tattoo culture in the 21st century has led to some remarkable reconstructions of ancient techniques. Modern tattoo artists working with archaeologists and historians have successfully recreated Viking-era pigments and tools, allowing them to produce tattoos that are as close as possible to the original designs. These reconstruction efforts have revealed just how advanced Viking tattoo artists really were. The precision of their line work, the sophistication of their color blending, and the complexity of their symbolic systems rival anything produced by contemporary tattoo artists using modern equipment. In many ways, the Vikings had achieved a level of artistic mastery that took the rest of the world centuries to rediscover. The legacy of Viking tattoo culture extends far beyond the realm of body art. The Vikings' approach to integrating visual symbols with personal identity, their understanding of the body as a canvas for storytelling, and their sophisticated use of color and pattern have influenced everything from graphic design to fashion to digital art. Perhaps most importantly, Viking tattoo culture represents one of humanity's most successful attempts to create a truly integrated artistic tradition, one that combined technical skill, spiritual meaning, social function, and aesthetic beauty into a single coherent system. The fact that this tradition produced such remarkable results using only natural materials and hand tools makes it even more impressive. The Vikings understood something that many modern cultures have forgotten, that the human body is not just a biological machine, but a sacred space that can be transformed into a work of art, a historical document, a spiritual tool, and a means of personal expression, all at the same time. Their tattoo culture achieved a level of sophistication and integration that remains unmatched in human history. Today, as we rediscover and reconstruct these ancient practices, we're not just learning about tattoo techniques. We're gaining insight into a worldview that saw art, spirituality, identity, and community as inseparable aspects of human experience. The Vikings didn't just have the best tattoos and body art of their time. They created a cultural framework that elevated body modification to its highest possible form, turning every tattooed person into a living masterpiece that honored both individual achievement and collective heritage.